What we'll do now is we'll discuss one of the most fundamental parts of hermeneutics, and it's literary genre. And literary genre is one of those things where it's so fundamental and basic that you can think, and not just me, we can all think, well, of course everybody kind of knows that. But it's one of those things that not necessarily do we know it as well as we think we do when it comes to reading the Bible. Now, one of the tricks is applying what we do in life intuitively to the Bible. That's really one of the big tricks about learning to read and genre just means sort of different types of literature, right? It's just a sort of a fancy word for different kinds of literature. And there's good reasons, I think, that we have a particular way of reading the Bible that we don't, in a way different, or a particular way of reading the Bible that we don't apply to other books. And that's because we have an awareness and a knowledge of what the Bible is. Because it is true that the Bible should be read like a book. On the other hand, it's also true that the Bible's not like any other book. And so we have to keep both of those things. We have to hold both of those things. And it's because of our awareness that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, I think, that causes us to sometimes make kind of fundamental errors in reading that we wouldn't do daily. Let me give you an example. Who has read lately a newspaper? And that includes electronic versions. Anything that has news in it. Just of any kind. News of your home, news of... Okay, most of you. In fact, almost 100% of you has read something. At least when your internet pops up, you at least get a glimmer of some kind of news. Who has read... This better be... there's only one answer I want for the next one. Who has lately read a book for any class? Oh, my word, you were slow to respond. Maybe it's your consciences. Okay. Who has in the past month or two read any kind of magazine or journal? Not a news magazine, but I mean some kind of magazine about something, whether it's sports or whoever knows what. Okay? Who in the last year or so has read anything fictional? Okay. Not enough hands, but that's okay. And who in the last year has read a technical manual of any kind? Phone, iPod, computer, how to put together a grill, anything. Wow. Well, okay. Most of you. How many people have ever read something like that? Ever. Instructions to anything. Okay, let's make it really easy. Okay, now one person is refusing to raise their hand. They've never read instructions on anything. Okay, I'm not going to point them out. They don't know who they are. And so, the point is, of all those things I just mentioned, and I can mention more, we've all read different sorts of things. And any given day, we read different sorts of things. And some people different. Some people more than others. But different examples. Like you read a newspaper, you read a magazine, say a magazine on sports, college football or something, or a style manual. You ever read the SBTS style manual? I mean, right. If you have insomnia of any kind, right, just get a copy of that. Though it might keep you awake, just from frustration. And so, wow. Probably shouldn't say that on tape, but there it is. It's out there. All right. Surely they can edit that out. Or a poetry of some kind, right? Now, some people might not be big into reading poetry, but we do read different things. And the point is, these are all examples of different kinds of literary genres. A computer manual is a kind of literary genre. We might not think of it that way, but it is. The Courier Journal, that is the local Louisville newspaper, that's a kind. In fact, that's a media that has different sorts of literary genre in it. So when we hear the phrase literary genre, we might be tempted to think of literature, like studying Shakespeare or something, but really it just means different kinds of readings. And the second thing is this. Most of us already intuitively know most of the things we need to understand to understand the concept of literary genre. It's just we do it intuitively. We know it intuitively. And we have certain expectations that when we read different sorts of books or literature. When you get a new computer or you buy new software, you don't read the instructions for their high literary value. And it's not disappointing to you. It's not disappointing to you when it's not written in poetic language. Right? Because what? You want it to tell you A, B, C, D. And then you want that to work. You want it to be as clear as possible. No double meanings. Single meaning only. Step by step by step by step by step. Then if you would put that down, and let's say you would pick up something like a Shakespeare play, you would immediately, intuitively have different expectations than when you read a computer manual. And you wouldn't confuse the two. You wouldn't try to read them in the same way. You just wouldn't. Naturally, you wouldn't do it. In the course of every day, we switch from one kind of literary genre to another without thinking. And we do it and follow the rules. Because different literary genre is composed of different sorts of rules for that kind of literature. Rules for how it's written and also rules for how it's read. Now, the same thing, the same principle can be and should be applied to the Bible. Because too often, we read the Bible as if it's just one sort of type of literature. So we'll read 1 Kings as though it's really just Paul in disguise. Or we'll read Psalm 23, as if it's really James or Peter or Paul in disguise. And try to turn it into that. Right? If you come from a sort of tradition like I do, the epistles get such pride of place that when other parts of the Bible are preached, really the main goal is to make them all Romans. And in doing so, we often will violate the sort of rules of that sort of literature. And we may end up saying good things, and we may end up saying true things, but the question is, are we saying and communicating what that particular text is saying? One of the most fundamental ways to help us understand how to communicate Scripture is to learn how to read different parts of Scripture. Just listen to this. Here's a big list. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that's within me. Bless His holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and do not forget all of His benefits, who forgives all your iniquity, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. Make an altar of acacia wood for burning incense. It is to be square, a cubit long and a cubit wide and 2 cubits high. Its horns of one piece. Overlay the top and all the sides and the horns with pure gold, and make a gold molding around it. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouth of the fool gushes folly. These are the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also, or will be also. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, to the saints in Ephesus, the faithful in Christ Jesus, grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature, and it had 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of about 200 miles. Now, you all know where those texts come from, generally speaking, at least. They all come from the Bible, and they are radically different sorts of texts. And all of them call for different sorts of reading. Now, not completely wildly different ways of reading, but they call for different kinds of reading. Just as you can hear the differences in communication, so we have to read them in different ways. And the authors intend us to do so. And we have to make it part of our job to do that, right? To understand what a wine press means. Sometimes a wine press is a wine press. Other times, it's a metaphor, right? And that's a relatively easy one to discern when it's a wine press. When a wine press is just a wine press. But all these texts are different, and we understand that they're all different. But one of the mistakes that Christians make, evangelical Christians make, is that we read them as if they're all the same, when in fact they're not all the same. They're all divinely inspired. They're all the divinely inspired Word of God. No doubt about it. But God, in His sovereignty and in His providence, uses this rich, diverse array of biblical literature to communicate to us. And so in one sense, this idea of literary genre, we should connect it to the idea of divine condescension. God graciously condescends to us to communicate to us, not just in sort of lists and numbers, but in all sorts of the whole variety and scope of human language and communication. And if God goes and makes this effort to speak to us in poetry, and to speak to us in apocalyptic, and to speak to us in letters, and speak to us in narrative and stories, then we should take the time and make the effort to be able to read all these in all of their fullness. Honestly, just like the way we do when we read different things when we're not reading the Bible. Right? So it's, in one sense, this whole idea of literary genre is just a common sense issue. On another level, a more serious level, it has to do with getting serious about interpreting the Bible the way it's written, the way it's given to us. And so the Bible's full of different genres, and different genres have different kinds of rules, and we need to learn the basic rules or principles. Now, what we're going to do in the next several sessions is not just sort of set out, here's the rules. We'll make basic general observations about how different sorts of genres look and work and function and communicate, and basic biblical theological things to have in mind when you're approaching different sorts of genres. But it's important to know the rules, because two pieces of literature may look alike. They may seem similar, but looks, are not all there is to it. I'll give you a good example. This is a very light-hearted example. Okay, so I used to live in England, and the English have this game called rounders. Anybody ever heard of rounders? You know what rounders is? Rounders is a lame form of baseball. It's just an English form of baseball. Okay? Now, they say it predates baseball, and maybe it did. But, well, you'll see in a second. So I live there, and they're going to play rounders. And I look at what they're doing. They're setting bases out. They have a bat, and they have a ball that you don't hit with your foot. And I thought, I'm in. This game is for me, because anytime we played soccer or football, I was stuck in goal. That's it. And they just hoped that I would somehow fall in front of the ball. But I wasn't ever allowed to kick it, right, for good reason. So we're playing this game of rounders. I thought, yeah, I'm in. This will be good. Baseball. They just call it baseball. So I'm watching them set up. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to play. And the first thing I notice is it's like one of these church softball games where there's no gaps. You know what I'm talking about? You ever play one of these church softball games where there are no gaps to hit? You know what a gap is? Okay, let me help. In sports, in baseball, a gap is a place where there's no infielder. right? You can hit it. You like hit it between the first and second baseman or the shortstop and the second baseman or whatever. Well, if you've ever played church softball at a picnic, I mean a pickup game, there's usually no gaps. And so what do? You have to choose the least likely person, right? According to size and other things, you choose the least likely person and make that your gap, right? And so you just hit straight at them, hoping for the best, right? That's strategy at church picnic softball. And so I decided I'm going to do this in rounders because there's like 30 people out there. And most of them are in the infield, but I'm thinking they're English, they can't catch. This is a shoo-in, okay? And so I'm standing there at the bat, and they bat, and of course, the ball comes nowhere near the plate. And you have to understand, I am running my mouth nonstop at 30, 35 Englishmen constantly about, oh, yeah, good throw. Maybe you should try it with your foot next time. All kinds of stuff. I mean, I'm just talking nonstop. Now, this is a Christian organization. I just want to make it really clear. Okay, so it's okay. And so I'm standing there with this bat, and the second pitch comes, and it's like over my head. And of course, that just eggs me on more. And the third pitch comes, and it doesn't even reach the plate. It like trickles across. That's 3. What does that mean? What's that mean? Third pitch. 3 balls, right? What am I waiting for? I'm getting ready to be walked. Well, the third pitch comes. When the third pitch comes, I just wait. So I'm waiting for one more pitch. The fourth pitch comes again. It's not anywhere near the strike zone. I'm just going to take my base. Well, they all erupt in screaming and telling me to run. They're all yelling, run, run, run. And I'm arguing, not running. Like, what do you mean run? That's 4 balls. I get a base. You just walked me. And they're all yelling, run, run, run. One of them casually picks up a ball and tags me. I'm out. And of course, I don't go out easy. And it turns out, as much as rounders may look like baseball, it's not baseball. On the 4th unhittable English pitch, you have to run. If you didn't hit it, you get to run on your 4th ball. And it's fair game. You can get thrown out. And that's exactly what happened. But you see what happened? What happened was I looked at what I thought was baseball. It wasn't baseball. I played by the wrong rules and I lost. The same sort of thing applies to literary genre. Just because something may look sort of similar, it's full of words and it has verses and it has chapters and it has books and whatever else, we can get confused in it and we can misread it. And the misreading of genre is probably one of the most fundamental and basic errors that we make as biblical interpreters. The genre of a text and learning to read the genre of a text is kind of like learning to read different kinds of maps, right? You think about different kinds of maps, right? There's a topography map, right? A road map, any number of maps. And they might all be maps of the same thing, but they give you sort of different perspectives and different ways of looking at something, different divisions. And that's basically what literary genre does. And so we have to take that kind of thing very seriously. And again, like I said, we're going to spend the time we have left, most of the time we have left, talking about the different sort of nuts and bolts parts of the Bible. Now, before we start doing any of that, does anybody have any questions? No? Is everybody pretty much familiar with the concept of literary genre? So what's the difference then between, saying, reading Psalms and, say, reading, I don't know, Romans? When you sit down, now you don't have to answer this out loud, when you sit down and think about it, and you're going to preach a text on Psalms, what do you do differently? How do you read it differently? Or if you sit down to, say, preach from 1st or 2nd Samuel, what is it you do? Now, I don't want you to answer out loud. I want you to take a few moments and reflect on What do you do when you sit down to a narrative text? Narrative makes up the majority of the Bible. And I think it's fair to say that it's the kind of genre we, in some ways, know the least in terms of what to do with it. And so let me ask you a question. What do you do? Let's say you're assigned this weekend, you have to lead a Bible study in 1 Samuel. What are you going to do? One of the things we often opt for is to try to read through it with an intention of finding the points. And then having found the points, sort of find a main point, and then we're ready to go. Okay? That might not be necessarily wrong, but how do you do that? When you're reading narratives, you have to look for certain things. It's not a matter of beginning by looking for points, because narratives are not arguments. Romans is an argument, right? And I don't mean that in an argumentative way, but Romans it's a discourse. Narrative is not. Narrative is a story. And stories should be read. And you have to look for things, because sometimes we have this idea that really the epistles, they kind of tell us what everything else means. I've heard sometimes people say, I like the epistles because the epistles explicate the Gospels. Practically speaking, that means the Gospels are subordinate to the epistles. But that's not true. It just happens that the Gospels and other narratives, they speak to us and teach us differently. So what are some of the main things? We'll start with narrative. And we'll think of narrative generally. We'll look at some examples, and then we'll talk about, probably in the next section, a specific way to think about reading at least Old Testament narratives. What are the kinds of things you look for when you read a narrative? Well, okay, tell me this. What are the kinds of things you look for when you read any kind of story? Yeah, okay, characters. Pretty easy. What else? Okay. Setting. Scene. Or scenes. What else? Okay, yeah, things like plot. Okay. Other things you look for are verbal markers. That can be any number of things. It can be a word, it can be a phrase, it can be a repeated word or repeated phrase. Any number of things can count for that. Here's a big one. Change of pace or speed. Any story writer worth their salt knows how to change the tone and pace of a story in such a way that carries the reader along with it, whether they're aware of it or not. Now, I could bring, from literature, I could bring in a million examples of where things slow down and you can have a fast-paced narrative, and all of a sudden, if you pay really close attention to the wording, what you'll feel it slowing down and tension building. How? From the language changing, or the words changing, or the tempo or the pace changing. And this happens in the Bible as well. Or thematic patterns. And again, it can sometimes be the change of a thematic pattern. These are just basic things. We'll develop this more. But if you're thinking about this and you might think, well, the Bible's not a story. Well, okay, it's not Moby Dick in terms of being fiction, but still, to a large degree, lots of the Bible is made up of stories written by people who are telling it like a story. And it's not somehow wildly secular to think about it in this kind of way. Sometimes people militate. I've had this reaction before. People will militate against these kind of things because they feel like it's somehow too secular to apply to the Bible. But this is just the kind of stuff that happens in a story. In sort of a microcosm, you can look at these kind of things and see them happen in a short story like a parable of Jesus. Same sorts of things happen. And so it's not sort of wildly secular. I'm not just applying like outside secular literary theory on the Bible or anything. I'm just talking about here's how stories work. And you can test this. If you have children, the next time you read a fairy tale to them or whatever it is you read to them, note, and you'll see this kind of thing happens. This kind of thing happens. Now, it takes maybe a little while to get excited about this kind of thing. But we often ignore it. But let me give you some examples. It's one thing to talk about in the abstract. Let me give you some examples. Some of them we talked about yesterday. As I gave an example yesterday, but it wasn't in this context. Do you remember I said in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, you have pretty straightforward narrative accounts of how things are happening. Right? For instance, the first one was the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the stars and the fish and the animals and everything else. It's very formulaic until you come to the 6th day. And then the pace of the story changes. In fact, the language of the story changes, and it becomes poetic, and all of a sudden you have God saying something totally different about the creation of humanity than He does about the creation of anything else. And it's not just the mere matter that all of a sudden God creates things and then creates humans. The language of the text changes to underline, to highlight, to emphasize that distinction. And it's all right there for the reading, if we'll read it. Let us make man in our own image. In the image of God, He made them. Male and female, He created them. That's different than the waters, the expanse above and below. Right? Without denigrating any of those things, it's not all the same. Even the language of Genesis chapter 1 points to the fact that we are not brothers and sisters of all of creation. We are not like everything else in creation. You know, the other example that I gave, and again, it was in a different context, we weren't really thinking about it in this way, is the creation of Eve. And Adam's sort of first soliloquy, as it were. It's sort of the first literary soliloquy in the Bible. Adam takes one, Adam is sort of pretty passive, and he's going through, and all of a sudden Adam speaks. It's just a narrative. It's not just a narrative. It's a narrative about God creating man and giving him commands on what to do, and creating all these other things that aren't good companions for Adam. And then all of a sudden, God creates Eve, and all of a sudden you hear the created man speak when he sees her. This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That ought to get your attention as a reader. Something particular, something peculiar, something special happening there. And as readers and interpreters, we should not just skip right over that as, oh yeah, Eve was created too. The Bible doesn't present it as, oh yeah, Eve was created too. Oh yeah, then there was Eve. And Adam was pretty happy about that. But that's how we sometimes talk about it. You know why? Because we don't slow down and pay attention to all the markers in the text that say, look at how significant this really is. And so you kind of have a change of pace and thematic sort of patterns, these kind of things happening. Obviously characters, these kind of things. These kind of things are taking place, and we're only talking about the first 2 chapters of the Bible, and you can read all narrative in this way if you'll slow down and do it. And how do you get good at it? By doing it. Not just by hearing some principles, but then by doing it. Let me give you some other examples. This is taken from a biblical scholar called Von Rad. I think it's also mentioned in Steve Dempster's book. Here's a matter of sort of word counts in the 7 days of creation. I'll just read them. Day one takes approximately 30 words. Day 2, almost 40. Day 3, close to 70. Day 4, close to 70. Day 5, nearly 60. Day 6, around 150. Almost double the amount of words are used to describe the creation of humanity over against the creation of anything else. And again, if you're reading and careful about it, and again, you don't have to be some genius reader. All you got to be doing is not take it for granted that, oh, this is the Bible, I've read the story of creation many times. And you read it and you hear that, and then on day 7, the close, you have around 40 words. So even that, see, that's just, I mean, I'm not saying every narrative you read, you kind of count words in every verse. That's not the point. But all I'm saying is, it doesn't take a great deal of specialized literary analysis to note something like that. And there could be many applications of that. I mean, we live in a world where the uniqueness of humanity is seriously questioned by many, 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 many people. Now, it might not be in the circles you're in at this moment, but many of you are thinking about going to do things like urban ministry and different sorts of ministries like this, or maybe ministry among certain sects and religions where all life is thought to be equal. You know what I'm talking about. Things like this are significant. It's always significant, but it's not, again, it's not just, oh, well, that's a clever fact. Here's a few other things. Again, these are things that I referred to yesterday, or in one of the earlier lectures. The first 11 chapters of Genesis, centuries. The next 10 chapters, 25 years. Again, should get your attention. In Genesis 12, 13, 15, and 17, in the midst of the narrative, these are 4 markers in the text where God specifically speaks out loud to Abraham. They're markers in the text. They're things around which the text hinges, and the text flows one to the other, to the other, to the other, to the next, to the next. Or take, for instance, the end of the story of Abraham. Chapter 23 of Genesis is very detailed. Can anybody tell me what the chapter is? I mean, I don't feel condemned if you don't. But can anybody tell me the content of Genesis chapter 23? It's very, very, very detailed. It's super detailed. Yeah, it's all about buying a burial place for Sarah. Do you remember the story? It's one of those stories you're like, okay, yeah, just buy it after all. Come on. And you might wonder, well, why is all this detail? And there's many witnesses mentioned too. And you read Genesis, I mean, it slows down to a snail's pace in this chapter, and there's lots and lots of witnesses mentioned. The details and the presence of the witnesses should get your attention. All of a sudden, there's lots of people involved, and they're named. Specifically, why? Just because it's a matter of historical curiosity? I suppose that's possible. But what's the significance? Abraham buys a piece of land in Hebron, in Palestine. Abraham does not inherit the promised land in his lifetime, right? But there are witnesses, there are human witnesses to the fact that Abraham legally owns, not just divinely promised, but legally owns a chunk of land in the middle of the promised land. It's his. And he and Isaac are also going to be buried there. Not only is God, I'm not saying that he has to have that in order to inherit it. All I'm saying is we know he's been divinely promised land, divinely promised a promised land. But here we know, and I think this is why you have this big detailed, I don't think it's just so the reader can understand the early sort of bartering process about what goes on. You know, he's like, no, certainly far be it from me to do that. No, you must do it. Okay, I'll do it. I'll take this much. I can't take that. It's not just to show you, oh, here's how they did business in ancient days. Now, you know, in our business today, what we need to learn from the principles here is it's not about that at all. It's not about building a better business by looking at how they did business in the ancient in ancient Palestine. That's not, the principle's not there. Right? But that's the kind of thing we'd be more tempted to do. Why? Because we know it's the divinely inspired Word of God, and we want to do something with it. So we might come to a thing like that and think, okay, so what are the principles here for dealing with one another? Well, one principle is humility. I don't want to force myself on somebody. But then there's a principle of, there should be a just price and a just price paid for, anything, but it has nothing to do with any of that. What it's about is a legal stake and ownership of a piece of land in Palestine that one day Abraham's children are going to own outright. I think that's the significance of it. Also in the narrative, and this is one that's not so difficult to see, there's a theme of childlessness. Right? You have Sarah, and then Rebecca, and then later, who's the next famous? Hannah. Right? Now this is a larger trajectory, but as you're going through, it should get your attention that there's this mention of these women who are unable to have children. When you get to Genesis 29 to 31 through 30:24, it should get your attention that the narrative really, really, really slows down. Why don't you just open up to there real quick? And again, I'm just using these as examples. We're not going to go through the whole narrative of the Bible in this kind of way. You ever been reading through this whole story of Jacob and Rachel and Laban and all this kind of thing and think, man, let's move on a little bit. You know why you sometimes... Now, maybe you're thinking, I never think that. Okay, maybe you haven't. But do you know how it really, really slows down? You're like, wow, there's lots of detail here. Why all the detail? Rather than looking at it as like, wow, this is really slowing down. It's kind of dragging. I'd like to see some action. Rather than sort of thinking about it that way... And again, I'm not just up here trying to point out all the bad things we do. Right? I mean, a lot of the things I'm saying are just to get everybody's attention about this. Because I'm talking about things I do. I tend to like, okay. I want to know the points. Give me the 3 points. So I can have an illustration, I can have a joke, an illustration, and a conclusion. Right? Too often I read the Bible that way. One of the ways of getting away from reading the Bible that way is to understand that's not the way to read a Bible anyway. And you're never really going to prepare sermons when you read the Bible in that particular way. But Genesis 29 through 29:31 through 30:24 really, really slows down. It should get your attention. Why does it slow down? It slows down for the birth of a nation. That's why. Abraham's been promised all these children. And it slows down and gives you in detail after detail the birth of the fathers of Israel. The tribes of Israel. All the sons of Jacob. And so it's significant. You see, it's significant in the fact that what you have here is, what is this? This is, 18 chapters later since we first heard that Abram is going to be the father of a great nation. Well, in the narrative, in the speed of the narrative, it slows down to talk about the birth of that nation. And here they are. And you also understand something important about, you don't just get, one day, by the way, here's the sons they have. You also understand who's the first son, who's the last son, and it's important to note later that who the third son is. He's not really the son of note. He's not the first son. He's the third son, but he's going to be singled out for something special. One by one, these sons of Jacob, the oldest sons are removed from the place of blessing. That is the firstborn, chief, heir. They kind of disqualify themselves in a way. Reuben, then Simeon and Levi, leaving Judah, who I think I keep calling the third, if I'm not mistaken. I keep calling him the third. But there's Reuben, Simeon, Levi, then Judah. Historically, Judah's story is not going to be very nice either. And the Joseph story starts in chapter 37. You ever notice this? You ever preached or read through, or you ever done a series on the Joseph story? Anybody? Or thought about it or read it? Okay. I meant read. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that you never read. I apologize. I didn't mean, hey, haven't you ever read the Bible? No, I didn't mean that. What I meant was, if you ever read it and then ask yourself the question, what's the deal with chapter 38? Because you get the Joseph story, you get the dream, and then you get to chapter 38, and you have this weird story of Judah and Tamar. And then back to Joseph. Why? 38. In some ways it looks like, oh, I'm writing this story. Oh, I forgot to talk about Judah. Let me put this in. Okay, now back to Joseph. It sort of looks that way, right? In some ways it does. Now, I'm not, of course, implying that it is that way or that we should look at it that way or anything. It seems kind of odd. But, see, again, if you're a careful reader of a narrative, it should get your attention to say, so what's here? What's so important in this chapter that this story that started off with, it's such an interesting story with Joseph and having a dream, right? And then going to his brothers saying, hey, guess what? You're all going to bow down to me. And then you know what happens from there. And then all of a sudden, and it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers, right? So Judah goes another way. And we get this side story about Judah. And what does Judah do? Judah goes out and lives among the Canaanites and marries a Canaanite woman. Not very promising. Now, there's the appearance of this woman Tamar, who's the wife of Judah's son, And what does she continue to do? She dresses like a prostitute and seduces Judah. And she gets his staff and his seal. And then Judah condemns Tamar when she's found to be pregnant. Right? Remember, why does Tamar do this? Do you remember the story?
Because Judah has given her his first two sons and refuses to give her the...
Yeah. She wants an heir.
It's the
levirate marriage. Yeah, she wants an heir, and she's not getting an heir. And so she's trying to ensure her future, basically. I'm not obviously condoning what she did, but that's what she's trying to do. And Judah condemns her, and then she shows up with what? Hey, I've got your things. And he changes his tune pretty dramatically, as one would in this situation. And then two sons are born, Perez and Zerah. And Judah's line in chapter 38 now travels through a Gentile woman who had wanted a blessing for her dead husband. And then Judah's staff will appear again metaphorically in chapter 49 of Genesis in Jacob's blessing about a warrior, an eschatological blessing that's going to come in the last days. From Judah will come a warrior king before whom all the nations will bow. And that's the next time we hear about Judah's staff. And it's through this line that is now has what? The blood line of Abraham now has Gentile blood in it. Through Judah. Not the firstborn son, but Judah. And now there's going to be a blessing that this son, mixed up in this weird sort of torrid affair in Genesis 38, through him is going to come an heir who will rule over the world. Through this Gentile woman. And I think that's why we have this extra time and this extra effort put into Genesis 30 to Genesis 38. Now, when I say it, I'm not saying that I just sort of stuck in my thumb and pulled out a plum. Of course, these conclusions I've come to from reading many, many people who are brilliant and write a lot about the Old Testament. So I didn't just come up with this myself. And I'm not trying to pass this off as something I just all of a sudden came up with. Judah, not only that, Judah's days will be marked, this is in the blessing, by abundance, overabundance of vines and wine. In fact, there will be so many vines, people will use vines to tie up donkeys and wine to wash their clothes. What's that all about? I mean, why? Now, see, here all of a sudden, the reason I'm stopping is, here all of a sudden in Genesis, this is later, of course, in Genesis 49, during the blessings. What's that mean? They're going to tie up their donkeys with vines and wash their clothes in wine. So everybody's going to have pink clothes, red clothes, and we're not going to have any ropes. What's the significance? It's written in metaphorical language, in picturesque language. What's it saying? The days of this heir of Judah are going to be so abounding and overflowing with abundance that we will have so many grapevines that we'll use them for commonplace things like tying up donkeys. That's how much we're going to have. We will be so overflowing with wine in those days that we can use it like water. That's how rich and abundant the days are coming, these days of this warrior king from Judah's line. And it starts to sound, if you read it like that, it starts to sound like things that Isaiah says and other prophets say. Why? Because what you have here is a pointer towards the Son of David, Jesus Christ from Nazareth, who now sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Right? And this is an indication, this is a pointer towards him, and we're pointed that way by the narrative slowing down. And of course, this becomes important, right? There's a theme here that we can connect in various ways. Because this starts a trajectory, a genealogical trajectory. Anybody else? Yeah, I left Rahab out. That's who I'm left out. There, sideline. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. Gentile women. Right? Beginning back with Tamar. The line that's going to ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Israel, already includes, by blood, Gentiles. Now there's more than one way to look at that too. There's one level to look at it and say, this isn't sort of like a pure line. It's a questionable line in some ways. On the other hand, it's a line that's already including, the inclusion of the Gentiles can even be seen here in this way. And in terms of it not being sort of like this pure line, don't forget Bathsheba is in here too. In the whole event of Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite. So there's another trajectory that starts back there at Tamar. If you think about Sinai, as readers, the Sinai narrative should get your attention, and here's why. Now on this, I am really reliant upon, again, Steve Dempster's book, Dominion and Dynasty. Some of you may be thinking, I should have just got that book and not taken this class. Well, yeah, but then you couldn't get credit. So, on the other, I guess you could look at it as like this. Now I don't need to read that book. There, choose your poison. Okay, so you start with Exodus. Israel at Sinai. 11 months in real time. 11 months in real time. 57 chapters. In narrative time. I mean, that's pretty significant. And if you take the Torah, there are 68 chapters before it, 59 chapters after it. The Sinai narrative, when they're at Sinai and they're getting the law and you get all the instructions on all the things that are supposed to happen, it falls prominently smack dab in the middle of the 5 books of Moses. Now, what this points to is some careful writing and careful presentation. Now, again, I believe in the clarity and perspicuity of Scripture. I don't really need to do this sort of number crunching to understand that, wow, this event is pretty important. However, usually a lot of times when I read that narrative, it doesn't occur to me, I don't stop and think, man, this narrative, the plagues and the plagues and the wanderings take a long time, but the plagues and coming up out of Egypt, that happens relatively quickly. But when you get here, time slows down, and all these things happen. And we talked about this yesterday, right? I mean, and I talked about it. Yeah, I guess it was yesterday about how many centuries, right? I guess I talked about it earlier today. You have all these centuries that pass in the first part of Genesis, and then lots of chapters in about 25 years pass. So you have this speeding up and slowing down of time throughout the Pentateuch. And it's not just in the Pentateuch. It's in narrative in general. And so this points us to a principle, and that is, if you want to read and interpret, narrative, your first job is to read these whole narratives. You want to say something, you want to preach about something, an event or the events at Sinai? Well, the first job is to read the whole entire story. That's job number one. And not just jump in. Not just jump in sort of Romans 5:12-21. I'm not saying that's the proper way to do Romans 5:12-21 either. But you don't just sort of jump in with Exodus, let me just randomly, 37. And some issue or some theme, some point. You read the whole story the same way you would read any other story. And that's the important thing. And again, I know these are principles, and I'm just trying to give you examples, to encourage you to see that really what we're talking about is not some magical mystery method. It's the method that's available to each and every one of us if we'll do it, and that is reading. Right? But it's careful reading. It's reading unlike we often do. When was the last time you read, let's say you read Moby Dick. Anybody start with chapter 31 when you read Moby Dick? And then jump back to My Name is Ishmael or Call Me Ishmael? No. You read it from beginning to end. Right? Or any other book that you've ever read. You didn't just jump in on some chapter and then go off and start talking to people about Crime and Punishment or, Runaway Ralph or something like that. That's a book I read in my childhood. That's where that came from. And so, again, tomorrow we'll talk about the ways to read specific narratives, and we'll do the David and Goliath story. But, I'll end with the examples here just to say that if you keep reading like this, you'll see that this kind of pattern keeps happening over and over again. new characters, significant characters, all of a sudden a character seemingly out of nowhere that may appear for a little bit then go away. And the way you interpret them, just like when you do the Naboth's vineyard, a significant amount of time on your part is going to need to be spent on. So what's the significance about this story? This guy Naboth and his vineyard, and Ahab and Jezebel, and what's going on here? What about the narrative up to this point is informing me about this story? A lot of times that story that you'll work on is just treated as sort of a social justice story. And there's a large component of it that is that, but it's more than that. So we come back together next time. What we'll do is we'll look at some specific narratives, one or two. In fact, what we'll do is we'll look at the narrative of David and Goliath. We'll go back to that, and we'll also do the narrative of the book of Judges, the whole book, and we'll read the whole book as a narrative. Well, we're not going to read every verse, but we'll look at it, and we'll apply this sort of threefold method of reading narratives. And we'll try to see how that works. And it'll be an issue of sort of combining all these different things. So as we wrap this introduction to narrative up, does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes.
I know it's real significant when you look at the whole redemptive history as it all unfolds. And I think I've heard messages before from Genesis, which will put chapter 38 next to chapter 39 and look at the difference between Joseph fleeing sexual temptation and Judah failing to do so.
Yeah.
I mean, that may be a secondary, but it's almost as if, and I've heard that multiple times, and it's like it totally just doesn't even bring into redemptive history. What do you do with that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that a secondary application?
No, I think it's there for us to notice. The question is a great question. The question is, what about the example of Judah in terms of sexual promiscuity, and then the example of Joseph in terms of sexual fidelity or refusing sexual promiscuity? They're standing right beside each other. Well, see, this is one of the things about narrative is you have both of these things taking place. You have this big thing of how this narrative of Judah is tied into this gigantic picture. It's in the line that's going to lead to David and the line that's going to lead to the Christ, to Jesus who is the Christ, Jesus Christ. And at the same time, you have the example of Judah, which is the fact that Jesus comes from the line of Judah doesn't all of a sudden elevate Judah's actions up to sort of Old Testament sainthood. It doesn't sort of put the stamp of approval on, well, you see, something good happened. I don't think the point of the story there is to say, well, yeah, it was bad, but here's the good stuff. Now, is there a principle there that God overrides in His providence and His plan of redemption, overrides these acts of sin for the good? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I mean, there's a certain application of that to this. Yes. And so there is this historical redemptive plane to it, but there's also at the character level, and I think it's there on purpose to compare Judah and what he did with Joseph, who is clearly shown to be a righteous man and completely in the right. And soon, in an ironic, of course we don't know this yet, but soon Judah is going to be bowing to Joseph, just like Joseph said he would. Right? Whatever the wisdom was of Joseph saying, hey, by the way, you're all going to bow down to me. Soon, they're going to appear in Joseph's sort of throne room, and they're all going to bow to him. As Joseph being the superior brother. And so, no, I think that we do, here's what I honestly think, I think we do both. And I don't think you try to do both at once. You don't try to, honestly, a way to fail is to try to think, you look at this and think, okay, I got this sermon, I've got to do this historical redemptive thing, and I've got to do this moral exemplar. Well, do both. Because I think both things are there. Because it's a text that's operating on more than one level. There's another level we're not even talking about. Not too much, and that is the development of the family of Abraham. Right? There's a mid-covenantal level. where you have and we talked about it, but not really in that regard. You also have the ongoing development of the covenantal promises in the middle. And so, that can't be denied. It's part of the story. It's a multi-level story. But I think the goal of preaching shouldn't be to try to, I've got to do all these things, because you can't do them all well. So you preach more than one sermon. I mean, that might sound like a simplistic answer, but that is honestly, what I try to do. And I choose. You can't say all of it. You certainly can't say all of it well. Now, again, the caution about the historical redemptive sermon is that it can end up being lots of interesting, fun facts about the Bible. That people go away thinking, wow, that was interesting. But it's meant to be more than that. And so that's the great challenge of that big picture perspective. But you see, the big picture perspective lends so much more richness to this story, other than it's just an example of a guy who was sexually promiscuous over against his brother who was upright. God's at work. See, it's not just a story about two brothers. It's a story about God at work through both of them, to bring about His appointed ends. That's a great question. In case I think I repeated the question, so I think everybody heard the question. Anything else? Yeah.
Would you say one or two things maybe about the pace you would recommend maybe preaching or teaching?
Oh, this is a great question. The question is, what about the pace of preaching or teaching narratives? Well, and I don't want to turn this into a homiletics class, but just let me make a few observations. One, there's no rule of the Medes and the Persians. It's not my view that narratives are best preached sort of to this week. We're going to do Genesis 38, 1 to 5. And then whatever the breakdowns might be. And then 6 to 10. I think that's a really good way to lose everybody and probably end up just making up a bunch of stuff because you run out of things to say. I think narratives should be preached as they're presented, and that is in their sort of multi-density, because they're all happening at once. And so I think the pace can be anything from, you can slow down and go through, or you can do it all in a block. It's challenging to do it all in one block, but it can be done. And I think you have to decide that based on your situation, based on your congregation, based on what is you're trying to do. You're trying to give them a big picture of the Bible, big picture of Genesis, big picture of Exodus, whatever. What your goals and plans are. That all has to come into it. But I think the narrative is a good example of how to preach expositorily in narrative, certainly in my book, does not mean I'm going to preach clause by clause. But this week it's going to be Genesis 1:38a. Because, why? I'm preaching expository sermons. Well, no, I'm not. Because I'm ignoring the fact that this is a narrative, this is a story, and I'm going to preach it as if it is Romans 5, 12 to 21, or Romans 5, 1 to 5, or Ephesians 2, 1 to 10. It isn't that. It has to be handled appropriately. But see, we actually have more freedom. You have lots of freedom, and you can still preach expository sermons. Believe it or not, it's true. And so the pace is up to you. But the one thing I think you have to always guard against is slowing down so much that you lose the fact that this is a story with characters and development, all these other kind of things happening. So in my view, the pace should always be somewhat brisk, and then you slow it down. You slow it down as you need to fit the appropriate part in the story. But there's lots of people who don't agree with everything I just said. So, and I don't know what to tell you about that.
At the risk of stepping on toes, since the chapters and verses were added later,
Yeah.
Can we really use the fact that there are so many chapters behind and so many chapters?
Yeah, you can. You can. The question is, since the chapters and verses were added later.
And they change size.
Sure, they do. Yeah, sure, they do. They change size. But it's not so much, we could count words. Because in rabbis and people trained in the Torah, they can tell you how many words appear between this and this and that. They know. They know it by words, not by chapters and verses like we do. This just is an easy way to show that you've got about the same amount of material here as you do down here. And it's not surprising, right, that it's not whatever would make this equal. I'm not good at math, and on the fly I'm even worse. 60-something. What is it? Somebody help me out. You're not good either. Okay. 64 point something, okay? There's a good reason why it's not like equal numbers of chapters, and it's what you're talking about. But, you know, the chapters and verse numbers are there. The chapters and verse numbers are there for convenience. And so, you know, I think the basic principle still stands. Okay? All right. Well, with that, we'll bring this discussion to a close. And when we come together next time, we will look at some specific narratives.